All right, guys, hopefully this will be the last one of these we'll do here to get us on pace this year. Japanese Meiji Restoration. We've been talking about Japanese industrialization, or the Industrial Revolution. We've also been talking about Japanese nationalism, and it fits in here when Japan modernizes. Now we remember, starting with the reign of Tokugawa Ieyasu in 1603, well into the 1800s, the Japanese practiced their policy of national seclusion. However, during this time, much of the world had undergone a great transformation. This was, as I said, the great quantum leap forward of the Industrial Revolution. So by the late Tokugawa era, the Japanese economy was completely different than that of its, colleagues, its contemporaries in the Western world. The Japanese were stuck in the past. It was everything in Japan was well behind the industrialized world. Now, for centuries, the Japanese had believed they had formed the best society possible. And the Japanese at this time were living in a system where about 80% of its people lived as farmers out in the countryside. They were a feudalistic, agrarian, rural society. The people were living hand to mouth. They had just barely enough food to feed themselves every day. The rice paddy farming techniques were the same that had been used in the 14, 15, 1600s. It required a lot of just pure physical human labor. There was no fertilizer. There was no hybrid strains of rice. There were no mechanical mechanized machines to help them. Coupled with that, to support the aristocracy, the samurais and the daimyos, taxes were very high, and a lot of it was still paid in food. Here's the portion of our crops, we're going to give it to you, samurai or daimyo, to live on. The Japanese farmers still didn't use a lot of cash, currency. So Japan in mid-1800 was not unlike different from Japan in 1300. No factory machinery, no steam engine, no mechanized production, and as such, there were no large pools of monetary capital, no money or factories for industry. Things were floating along as they always had. And then the game changer happens. The story I told you about Admiral Perry sailing into Tokyo Bay. This completely will revolutionize Japan. And within 15 years, Japan's feudal system will collapse nearly overnight. Modernization, industrialization began. Japan, who saw themselves as a highly civilized country, had to make a radical shift that we know as the Meiji Restoration that will last from like 1868 till 1912. As Japan began to look at themselves differently, their young men once again went to study the technology of Western countries, governmental systems, legal systems, political systems. And when they returned, the primary goal of the Japanese government began to form a modern Japanese economy. This was going on during the age of imperialism, where we are now. Japan saw that military strength and power were the way to get what it wants and what it needs. We've got to be strong militarily. They wanted modern implements. They wanted telegraphs. They wanted a modern roadway system. They wanted steam engines, railroads, factories. They wanted all of this stuff, and they wanted it now. And it's the Japanese imperial government that is going to be in charge of making this happen. And things start slowly. Industrial production was barely measurable, and that's because nobody knew what to do. The factory owners, the government workers had to do it, excuse me, figure it out, and understand it, and then teach it to their managers, and teach it to their line leaders, and to their factory workers. Nobody knew what to do, so it took time. So, as they're doing this, one of the very first things they do, besides create a modern workforce, is the creation of industrial combines, known as a zaibatsu, all right? All of this stuff that's adopted from England and the United States is going to take time. And they implement everything from the factories to schools to post office to university. So we need teachers, we need engineers, we need lawyers, and we bring in our young students back and we hire consultants, but it takes a long time. And what happens as a result of this is the creation of a Japanese corporation known as a zaibatsu. The hardest part about industrialization was getting enough capital, whether money, straight out raw money, or industrial goods like a factory to make a corporation. And it's solved, one of the first, by this guy, Iwasaki Yatoru. Now he was a former samurai. And the samurai are left out in the cold early on because no one really needed them anymore. We're doing something different. But the smarter samurai families will adjust to all of this, like the Hondas and the Toyotas and the Fujiwaras. And Isawaki managed a small shipping fleet as a samurai, like moving boats, shipping goods from the farmlands to the big cities. Drawing on his experience working on the water, he got a collection of old, outdated ships from the government, and he slowly began a shipping and transportation business. He would go out into Tokyo Bay, unload cargo from big transoceanic American ships, and ferry it to the harbor. And as his business grew, he bought more ships and better ships and even bigger ships until he had a large fleet. With the money that Yatoro made, being the prime movers of loading and unloading cargo, he creates a bank known as Mitsubishi. So it becomes known as the foundation of the modern day Mitsubishi Corporation, the engine and car and small engine manufacturer. All right, other zaibatsus quickly follow suit. And what is going to help Japan is a new railroad system. Due to the geography of the country, it was extremely difficult to move inland, like we talked about in Korea and in Greece. It was extremely expensive to ship things internally. This archipelago, different islands, mountains, you name it. However, railroads solved this problem. And areas that were at one time an untapped resource, where there was populations to work or resources to get to, no one is isolated anymore. It was easier to sail around the islands than go 50 miles inland from here to Greensboro. It was just too hard. Well, not only do the railroads open up new resources, they open up new sources of labor as well. And the Japanese people, here comes their nationalism, are united in this effort. It creates a stable environment to work in. The people of Japan have this strange, very interesting mindset where they are able to sacrifice short-term tangible gain. Like here in America, we want it now, we want to see the fruits of our labor. The Japanese were after long-term result. They may not enjoy the fruits of their labors, but their children and grandchildren would, 30 to 50 years down the road. And so Japan moves from this feudal economy to a modern industrial one practically overnight. And so by the time we hit the 1900s, by the earliest 20th century, Japan had made just incredible gains. They sought acknowledgement for what they had done, believing the acquisition of colonies and imperial conquest by the military was the way to get Europe's attention. And so the Japanese have to go to war against an opponent. They had already beaten China, and this is when they had fought Russia. And Theodore Roosevelt will write the treaty ending the Russo-Japanese War, heavily favoring Japan. And here's where what we're doing in class gets intertwined. By the outset of World War I, the Japanese were acquiring raw materials to help their industry grow, especially iron production, coal mining, and chemical manufacturing. And when there was war going on in World War I, when England and France and Germany are in their death match, nobody was paying attention in Asia. And this allows Japan to go into Korea and deeper into China and even into Southeast Asia. And so all of this helps Japan grow. And by the end of World War I, Japan was one of only two functioning industrial economies in the world, the United States being the other one. So as a result, Japan was given a seat at the Paris Peace Conference, at the Treaty of Versailles. Japan was extremely proud of their achievements. Their manufactured goods were equal to in quality and in price. And while Western Europe and the United States underwent the growing pains to industrialize, experiencing trial and error, Japan had the blueprint. They had help from Europe. They had help from the United States. So in record time, just barely 40 years from 1868 to 1912, they're fully and totally industrialized. So by the 1920s, Japan takes on a modern look. The cities were looking more Western, the standard of living was raised, school-age boys and girls went to school. They had a very high literacy rate. The people in the workforce worked long, hard hours, but little by little, all right, Japan was catching up. Here's President Roosevelt, here's the old, feeble-looking Russian Empire, and here's the young, Western-looking Japan. All right, they are doing everything that the West is doing. Unfortunately for Japan, right before the outset of the Great Depression hit the Western world, a massive earthquake strikes the country. It erased all of the hard-won economic gains they had made in this 40-year period. All right, because they tried to do all the rebuilding internally. We don't need help from the United States, who wasn't helping anybody anyway, because we were isolated. Japanese goods become highly priced. There wasn't enough raw materials. There was no importation of things, and it causes massive inflation for Japanese products. There was simply no raw materials to get, and what was there is deeply expensive. And the manufacturing centers, these factories that were built, were heavily damaged. So imported items from England and the United States are cheaper. And so Japan sets about rebuilding from the great earthquake, and then the Depression hits, 1929. It's like a second blow to Japan. And the Great Depression will reciprocate worldwide. And we think about it here in the United States, well, it hits Japan and even Europe even harder. There, for the first time, was massive unemployment in Japan. And as a result of this, there was a switch in the government from a civilian-minded industry, well, look, what the civilians doing didn't work, to a more militaristic one. The best way to get yourself out of a depression is to make weapons for war. So Japan, not only did they industrialize faster than anybody else, they also recovered from the Great Depression way before anyone else. By 1934, when it hits America and Germany its hardest, Japan has already recovered. And the reason for this, as I said, was that industry was geared towards the military, manufacturing military weapons, iron and steel production. Plus, Japan will build electrical power plants and chemical factories, focusing on new technologies and better science. And so by the 30s, when the Great Depression is hitting the West hard, the young upstart Japan is outgaining everybody. And Japan still wanted recognition. Good job, fellas, from the great Western imperial powers. So around the young Emperor Hirohito, ancient samurai values, who we discarded after Commodore Perry showed up, are brought back out. Discipline, military chain of command. And these military advisors, like a guy named Hideki Tojo, said that if the West could conquer foreign lands for resources, then so could Japan. And Emperor Hirohito is now the revered head of the government. And while China is fighting its own war of nationalism between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, the Japanese went after the very rich territory and natural resources like oil and rubber from the Dutch East Indies and Southeast Asia. This will not only threaten the Western European powers, but the United States as well. And in the 1930s, people are shocked after this, the Spanish Civil War. The Japanese government joins Italy and Germany, forming the Axis powers. The world would turn on a Tokyo to Rome to Berlin axis. And Japan in the 30s begins to plan the attack on the United States, making World War II a truly world war. Japan will industrialize quicker and faster than anyone else in world history by studying and borrowing ideas and then making them their own. As a result, they caught up with Europe and the United States in a very short time span. They sacrificed short-term, gratification for long-term gain, and Japan becomes a superpower, a modern nation, virtually overnight. All right, guys, hope you enjoyed that. Hope somebody watches this. And that is Japanese industrialization and the Meiji Restoration from, wow, no wonder this looks crooked. There we go, that would have been better, huh? From 1868 to 1912.